Hi everyone, we're going to start labeling these anatomical diagrams from chapter 27. Hopefully you already attempted them. So here we'll go through them together so you can check your answers. We'll start off with the female reproductive system. In the female reproductive system you can see several structures over here, including the vagina, the cervix, and the ovaries. The posterior view is the one that we'll be labeling so that we can get a view of the ovaries. Otherwise, from the anterior view, the ovaries are not directly visible. They're blocked by this broad ligament, as we'll see. And this is a sagittal view that we'll get to. So let's just start labeling the diagrams in no particular order specifically. We'll just start off over here. So this structure, this little tubular structure over here, that's called the fallopian tubes, the uterine tubes. We'll stick with the common names, the fallopian tubes. The fallopian tubes are there to guide the released oocyte from the ovaries through these finger-like projections at the distal end of the fallopian tubes are called the fimbriae, Latin for fingers. They will collect the oocyte into the fallopian tubes, and if fertilization were to occur, it would occur in the fallopian tubes. The sperm will travel down the vagina, the uterus, into the fallopian tubes, and that's where typically fertilization of the ovum occurs over there. So that particular structure whereby the ovum is released is obviously the ovary over there. So that's this little line. That's the ovary. And the rest of the structure over here is a broad ligament, and in the female reproductive system the term ligament is a very loosely used structure to represent basically anything that connects any two other structures. It's really broad. A ligament is not bone to bone. Here it's just ligament is between connective tissue, essentially between any two structures. In this case here, this very broad sheath that you can see is called, no surprise, the broad ligament. The broad ligament contains many structures, including this little structure going through the broad ligament that comes from the bladder, and that's called the ureter. Blood supplies and various arteries and veins all travel either in or through the broad ligament. So we're not going to go through that level of detail over there. This particular structure over here is not important, but that box, that's called representing the proximal end of the cervix, where the vagina meets the cervix. Sorry, the vagina meets the uterus. It's the cervix, obviously. So that's the cervix. The cervix is normally closed except during childbirth, where it will dilate, open up to allow birthing to occur. Also during menstruation, the cervix opens up a little bit to allow the menstrual blood flow to occur as well. Here, this tubular muscular structure, that's obviously the vagina. And right in the center of the cervix, the cervical opening is called the cervical os, or just os for short. The pocket between the vagina that's formed and the cervix, that's called the fornix, actually. That's this line over here, not really labeled and not really important, but anyways, that's what it is. All these arteries over here are the uterine arteries. This one over here will be the ovarian artery. It doesn't really matter. Let's look at the uterus itself. This is the fundus of the uterus, at the top of the round top part of the uterus. And then for the uterus itself is made up of several layers. The innermost layer, which is this thing over here, pointing to the innermost layer, that's the endometrium. And the muscular part of the uterus is the myometrium. All of which together obviously forms the uterus, the walls of the uterus. You can see here's the ovary held by the ovarian ligament. I guess I blocked it out, but anyways, you can see. So the ovaries are held to the uterus through the ovarian ligament, a ligament being a very broad term to represent any connective tissue structure, fibrous tissue structure that connects any two structures, really, over there. What else do we have over here? I think we've pretty much labeled everything in this anterior view. over here. So the ovum would go through the fimbriae into the fallopian tube. That's where fertilization typically occurs, and then the fertilized ovum would get implanted in the endometrium. Don't forget to go through the ovarian and endometrial cycles in terms of the physiology of the female reproductive system. Over here we have a sagittal view, so we've split the body down in half, and here we get a better look at the other structures in the pelvic cavity. So let's identify the structures we've already seen. Here, that's the ovary. That will be the fallopian tube or the uterine tubes. This, pointing to this whole structure over here, that's the uterus. And now there are a couple of other associated structures over here. This is the round ligament of the uterus. That's again not important, but this structure over here. Firstly, let's label what's anterior and posterior. So going this way and going that way, yes, it's a sagittal view, but we still need to get our bearings straight. So what's anterior and posterior? This is anterior, because you can see the pubic symphysis over here, so not labeled actually, but this is the pubic symphysis. The bone, and hence you can see that particular structure is the bladder that is anterior to the uterus over there, and there's sometimes a pocket over here as well between the uterus and the bladder. But these structures, I think they are pointing to the but they're probably pointing to the external genitalia of the female, so that should represent the labia minora, and that's the labia majora over there. And the tubular structure coming down from the bladder, that's obviously the urethra. That's what this box is pointing to. And this is the vagina, the muscular tube coming from the uterus. And lastly, the structure that is posterior to the uterus, that's the rectum. So this hopefully gets you a better view of the organization of the various structures in the pelvic cavity as related to the female reproductive system. So please also view the other diagrams in the textbook, in the slides, wherever else you might find them. There are several other diagrams posted on Blackboard in chapter 27, so please have a look at them as well in terms of the female reproductive system. Here we have the male reproductive system. We probably should have labeled the previous female reproductive system diagrams. So that's the male reproductive system. Again, in no particular order, let's just label the structures. Fortunately, the testes is already labeled for you. So there's a structure just above the testes over here that is really continuous with the testes, and that's called the epididymis. In the epididymis, we have the collection of the spermatogonia that will ultimately be released, as we'll see, through the vas deferens over there. So we'll start off with this. This is the epididymis. The epididymis over here. And here's a better view, or more high magnification view of both the testes and the epididymis. So here's the head, so to speak, of the epididymis. Here's the tail of the epididymis. Where's my little die? There's my pen. I'm only going to briefly touch upon the functions of these structures over here. Please refer to the handwritten notes or the slides for a full description of exactly what occurs in these anatomical structures. In the testes, we have the collection, huge collection of these seminiferous tubules. Previously, in that short video on the physiological functions when related to the male reproductive system, we remember the Sertoli cells, the so-called NURS cells, and those cells are where the spermatogenesis occurs, and the Sertoli cells are part of these seminiferous tubules over there. So these are literally tubules, and some of the cells in the seminiferous tubules, if you just draw one cell over here, Oops, I don't think I can draw that small. But one particular cell over here, that will be one Sertoli cell in the seminiferous tubules that's involved in spermatogenesis over there. So anyways, those are the seminiferous tubules. It's not drawn to scale. There's many, it's very, very long and highly coiled, but spermatogenesis occurs in these seminiferous tubules, and ultimately the mature sperm is stored mainly in the epididymis, and then ultimately when ejaculation occurs, it's transported up this muscular tube called the vas deferens, which is part of the spermatic cord. The testes, as we all know, are not within the viscera of the body, is not within the body, it's really outside of the body, and that has to do with the temperature regulation. Spermatogenesis occurs best at a slightly lower temperature than normal body temperature, 37 degrees Celsius. As you can see, the testes are outside the body, so the temperature is a bit lower, and that's when spermatogenesis occurs. So the testes usually starts to descend after either just before birth or a couple of weeks after birth, and that's when the testes descend. And spermatogenesis does occur, but the sperms don't get fully mature until after puberty over there. So that's the testes and the epididymis in a little bit greater detail over there. We're going back to the diagram on the left. The testes, as you can see, are enclosed in a sac-like projectum called the scrotum. And if we just again orient ourselves, this blue structure over here, that's the pubic symphysis. Pubis symphysis, and hence this is anterior, and that's posterior. I guess we should have written down the view. This is naturally a lateral view of the male reproductive system. So seminiferous tubules in the testes, then the mature sperm stored in the epididymis during ejaculation that travels through this muscular tube. I guess that little box over there, that's the vas deferens. The vas deferens joins up with the duct from, well, I guess it's a bit hard to see over here in this view, but it joins up with a duct from this particular gland over here, the seminal vesicles, which are paired, one on each side. Oops, I can't even spell vesicles. V-S-I-C-L-E-S. The secretions from the seminal vesicles and the vas deferens join up together to form this structure over here, which is the ejaculatory duct. Which in turn drains, and here that within this entire organ, which is the prostate, it drains through the prostate into the prostatic urethra over here. So here's the ureter coming into the bladder from the kidneys, and obviously this is the bladder. Then the urethra comes through the bladder. At first it goes through the prostate, so that's called the prostatic part of the urethra. The ejaculatory duct joins it, and then it continues on into the penis. So this will become the penile part of the urethra. We can just label this as the urethra. But there are really two, that's called the spongy part of the urethra. So this is the prostatic part of the urethra, and then that's the penile part of the urethra going into the penis itself. And if we just do the penis, this is the prepuce of the penis, which is the foreskin, and that's the glands of the penis. Over here. And this little accessory organ over here, that's called the Cowper's gland. So sperm obviously comes from the epididymis through the vas deferens, then it joins up with secretions from the seminal vesicles as well as the Cowper's gland to form ultimately semen during ejaculation. Otherwise the urethra just will carry urine out from the bladder. The prostate, the seminal vesicles, and the Cowper's gland all have various secretions, we're not going to go into that level of detail, that help to nourish and sustain the sperm, and it essentially forms the bulk of the semen, of the secretions in the semen over there. Sperm is less than really 10 20% of semen. The rest are secretions from the prostate, the seminal vesicles, and the Scopus gland over here. A couple of other structures that are just not labeled. This thing, that's the rectum, and this is the coccyx and part of your sacrum over here, so that's a bony structure, so that's why that's obviously posterior. So it goes the sacrum / coccyx, then the rectum, then the bladder, and the prostate, etc. And then the most anterior structure that you can palpate would be the pubic symphysis over here, right? So it's really very different from the female reproductive system. There's obviously no uterus. So that's it in terms of much simpler for the male reproductive system. On the other video explaining the core physiological principles of the reproductive system, we went through quite extensively the menstrual cycle, which, as we saw, is really two cycles, the ovarian cycle and the endometrial cycle. This particular diagram just gives you a little bit of a further view, not further, but it's really the same view, just a slightly different perspective, different diagrams of the menstrual cycle. So I thought we could go through quickly labeling this, so you have, again, a little bit further cementing of the knowledge of the menstrual cycle, which is the ovarian and endometrial cycle, along with the associated hormones. So we'll start off by looking at the ovarian cycle. So you can see the various stages of development of the oocytes over here. We're not going to label every single one. We'll just look at the phases. So this particular phase over here, that's called the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, right up to kind of over here, the follicular phase. And then around day 14, so let's label this. Here you can see menstruation has occurred. This is the endometrium. We're now in the endometrial cycle. So if this is day 1 over here, and that's obviously 28, and I'll start off with day 1, so we're assuming a 28-day cycle. That's day 7, that's day 14. Hence, at the end of the follicular phase, what marks the boundary of the follicular phase is when ovulation has occurred over here. So that's ovulation from the secondary oocyte. And now we form the corpus luteum, so this is the luteal phase. Whereby the corpus luteum is formed, and that will secrete, if you remember, progesterone. Yes. And if conception doesn't occur, then the corpus luteum will form the corpus albicans, and that will degenerate and essentially form scar tissue, and it'll get buried deep into the ovaries. The ovaries have a fixed number of ovum that really is formed fully by 20 weeks of gestation, and after that you will slowly lose those eggs over a period of time over there. So there's a fixed number of oocytes, and you slowly lose them over the years. Every cycle, suddenly you lose one particular oocyte. Okay, so that's the ovarian cycle. You can see ovulation occurs from the secondary oocyte at day 14 approximately. Let's switch to the menstrual cycle now. Sorry, the endometrial cycle. The menstrual cycle is a combination of the ovarian and endometrial cycle. So we have different color codings over here. In pink, this is menstruation. So menstruation begins at this, marks the boundary of the start of menstruation of the menstrual cycle. So that's the menstrual phase. That should be an L. Okay, let me erase that. So that's a menstrual phase. We're looking at the endometrial cycle. In green, we have the proliferative phase, whereby the endometrium becomes thicker under the influence of which hormone we'll see. And then we have this creamish color over here. That's the secretory phase, whereby the endometrium is nourished and getting ready for implantation of the fertilized ovum. So that's the secretory phase over here. So menstrual phase, that's the proliferative phase, and that's the secretory phase. And then the cycle continues, assuming it's a 28-day, perfect 28-day cycle. And that will be back to day 28, and then you continue the cycle over there. So let's look at the effects of the various hormones. We have 4 hormones that we need to be concerned with. Actually, we'll start off with this graph over here. This shows you an increase in, this is body temperature. So what causes the increase in body temperature around ovulation? And that's the typically the old way, how your mother would teach you or taught you, if to predict ovulation, your body temperature would rise slightly. And the problem is you would have to monitor it a couple of days before and a couple of days after, and you would notice only approximately, and it varies, a half a degree rise in body temperature. And we'll see what typically triggers that increase in body temperature, which of the hormones. So we have 4 hormones: LH, FSH, estrogen, and progesterone. So we'll start off over there labeling estrogen. This is estrogen. Estrogen is released by the granulosa cells, and so it's really the thicker and granulosa cells, because the thicker cells provides the precursors. So it's estradiol, that's the main estrogen. So estrogen starts getting released. Normally estrogen has a negative feedback effect on the anterior pituitary, causing LH and FSH productions to decrease. So as estrogen levels rise, you can really LH and FSH levels decrease a little bit. But sometime along in the proliferative or follicular phase, proliferative for the endometrial cycle, follicular phase for the ovarian cycle. So in the follicular phase, estrogen now has a positive feedback effect, and that rise in estrogen causes a surge in this hormone, which is LH. So the surge in LH triggers in turn, if I move up a bit, ovulation. There we go. So you can see this is day 14, right? So just prior to ovulation, you can see how LH surges. If LH fails to surge, ovulation does not occur, period, over there. And that's what the ovulation tests that you can buy from shoppers and other drugstores, that's what they detect, LH. That's what they're detecting. So when you detect that surge for LH, you know ovulation is close at hand. And if you're planning on getting pregnant, then you know the deed that needs to be done. On the other hand, you can see that FSH also starts to increase, but its relative increase is not as much as for LH. It's LH that's required for ovulation. Estrogen levels now decrease, and it switches from positive back to negative. As estrogen levels decrease, you can see FSH levels will also decrease, so it's still positive over here, effect. And at this time, let's look at this particular structures over here. This is the corpus luteum. Oops, Lu. Let me erase that. That's a corpus luteum. Oh, again, I did it. That's a corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum, after ovulation, is present in order to secrete progesterone, and that's this hormone over here. Progesterone is what's needed to maintain the thickness of the endometrial wall. It promotes angiogenesis, meaning you can see new blood vessels starting to form. Glandular structures also increase, so there's more secretions. That's why it's called the secretory phase. All this is to prepare the endometrium for implantation by the hopefully fertilized ovum. If fertilization does not occur, then the corpus luteum degenerates into the corpus albicans. You can see progesterone levels fall off a cliff, and when progesterone levels starts dropping, that's the trigger for the vasoconstriction of these endometrial spiral arteries. That causes local ischemic injury, and these endometrial cells essentially die and they get slugged off, and that's the start of menstruation over there. So that's the entire menstrual cycle in depth, and that's just a quick overview. Please watch the other video if you want a more detailed description of the various phases of the ovarian cycle, the endometrial cycle, together the menstrual cycle. So there'll certainly be questions related to the menstrual cycle on the final exam. So please go through this and see if you can label that. Don't be surprised if you find similar looking diagrams and you'll have to label which is LH, FSH, estrogen, progesterone. Lastly, I've provided you with the same diagram. This is straight from those other video, the diagram from the other video that I was describing. So I'll leave it to you. If you can label this yourself. It's very similar. I don't think it's very difficult. Here are the phases of the ovarian cycle. Remember, there are 2 phases, follicular and luteal phase. And then we have the endometrial cycle over here, which really is divided into 3 phases: the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, and then the secretory phase over there. And you can see the layers. This one neatly is labeled the myometrium as well. That will be deep to the endometrium, so that's the uterus. So see if you can label the hormones and the different phases of both the ovarian and endometrial cycle. That's it for this short video on labeling the anatomical diagrams. Please make sure that you know how to label for the female reproductive system. If I can just scroll up over here. the uterus, the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, the vagina, and the fimbriae, and for the different view, the bladder, the relationship of the uterus to the bladder and the rectum. And lastly, also, please make sure that you can label the, oh, don't forget here, for the female reproductive system, the opening of the urethra is within the vestibule of the vagina at the end over here, so make sure you know that as well. For the male reproductive system, please make sure you know the relationship between the rectum, the prostate, the bladder, and the penis, and the function of the testes, the epididymis, and how be able to trace the flow of sperm from the testes to the epididymis out through, during ejaculation, through the vas deferens. The vas deferens will join up with, that's kind of what it's kind of showing over here. It's a little bit hard to see on this view, the sagittal view, the lateral sagittal view, but the vas deferens will join up with the ejaculatory duct, with the duct from the seminal vesicles to form the ejaculatory ducts, and that in turn will join up with the urethra over here. So be able to trace the flow of semen through the male reproductive system. And lastly, here's the testes, the seminiferous tubules, and the epididymis as well. So that's it for the male and female reproductive system. Not that many structures, but please make sure you practice it so you don't get any of the anatomical questions wrong. More importantly, it's to focus on the physiology, which, especially for the menstrual cycle, as you can see, it's a little bit more complicated. There will be questions related to that as well. That's it. Thanks. Have a great day. Bye.